Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1923 brought an unprecedented drought to the remote valleys of Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Wells that had flowed freely for generations suddenly ran dry, and the mountain communities found themselves facing a crisis that threatened their very survival. Springs that had never failed became mere damp spots in the earth, and families were forced to travel increasingly greater distances in search of clean water. It was during this desperate time that word began to spread about a place where water flowed freely, where any traveler could fill their containers without payment or obligation. The source was a well belonging to Mavourneen Blackthorne, a widow who lived alone in a cabin at the end of Hemlock Ridge Road, where civilization gave way to wilderness, and the nearest neighbor was more than 5 miles through dense mountain forest. Mrs. Blackthorne had been offering free water to anyone who requested it, since her husband Cornelius had perished in a mining accident during the winter of 1922. The gesture appeared remarkably generous, particularly during those parched months when some families were considering abandoning their homesteads entirely. She never requested names from her visitors, never asked for compensation of any kind, and rarely engaged in conversation beyond the necessary courtesies. Travelers would approach her remote property, fill whatever containers they had brought from the stone-lined well beside her weathered cabin, and depart with nothing more than a silent nod of acknowledgment from the thin woman who seemed perpetually stationed on her covered porch, watching every movement around her property with dark, unblinking eyes. The well itself appeared unremarkable by the standards of Appalachian mountain construction. Hand-excavated sometime during the 1870s, when the Blackthorne family had first established their claim to the isolated hollow, it measured approximately 4 feet across and descended roughly 35 feet into the limestone bedrock that characterized much of the geological structure in that region of West Virginia. The stonework had been carefully constructed by Cornelius Blackthorne's father, according to township records, and the water maintained a consistently cold temperature and clear appearance throughout all seasons. What distinguished it from neighboring water sources was its unwavering flow during a period when wells throughout the county had failed completely, leaving communities desperate for any reliable source of clean water. Mavourneen Blackthorne was known throughout the scattered mountain settlements as a woman who valued privacy above all else. Born Mavourneen Cassidy in 1883 in the coal mining region of McDowell County, she had married Cornelius Blackthorne in 1904 and relocated to his family's isolated homestead deep in the mountains. The couple had maintained an exceptionally private lifestyle for nearly 2 decades, with Cornelius making infrequent trips to the county seat for essential supplies, and Mavourneen rarely venturing beyond the boundaries of their remote property. They had lived without close neighbors, which was not uncommon in the mountainous terrain where homesteads were often separated by miles of difficult terrain and dense forest. When Cornelius died in February of 1922, the circumstances were officially recorded as accidental death by cave-in the county registry. Dr. Thaddeus Mortimer, who had served the isolated mountain communities for more than 25 years, made the arduous journey through winter conditions to examine the body and complete the necessary legal documentation. The burial took place on the family property, marked by a simple stone marker that Mavourneen had commissioned from a local stonemason. She politely declined offers of assistance from distant neighbors and made it abundantly clear that she preferred to manage her grief and her affairs in complete solitude. The severe drought conditions began manifesting during the late spring of 1923 and intensified throughout the summer months. By early September, families throughout Pocahontas County were hauling water from sources more than 10 miles from their homes, and several homesteads had been completely abandoned as their residents relocated to areas with more reliable water access. It was Temperance Fairfax, the wife of a timber worker who lived in a cabin approximately 6 miles down the mountain, who first encountered Mrs. Blackthorn's unusual offer. Temperance had been returning from an unsuccessful expedition to locate water at what had once been Crowley's Spring when she noticed smoke rising from the Blackthorn property and decided to inquire about possible water sources in the area. According to Temperance's later testimony to county authorities, Mavourneen emerged from her cabin as soon as she approached the property and, without any verbal exchange, simply gestured toward the well while indicating that she was welcome to take whatever water she required. The widow provided a sturdy rope and bucket system for drawing water from the considerable depth, though she insisted that visitors operate the mechanism themselves, rather than offering direct assistance. Temperance found the water to be exceptionally cold and refreshing, with a slightly mineral taste that she attributed to the natural limestone filtration common in the region. Word of the widow's generosity spread through the mountain communities via the informal communication networks that connected the scattered homesteads. Soon, a steady stream of water seekers began making the difficult journey up the winding mountain paths to the Blackthorn property. Some traveled on foot, carrying wooden buckets. Others arrived with horse-drawn wagons loaded with multiple containers, and a few made the trip using crude wheelbarrows or sledges to transport larger quantities of water back to their families. Mavourneen never refused anyone, regardless of the quantity they sought to collect or the frequency of their visits. The widow developed a predictable routine around these visits. She would emerge from her cabin at the first sound of approaching travelers, position herself on her front porch where she maintained a clear view of the well area, and observe silently as visitors went through the process of drawing water. Those who encountered her during these exchanges described her as unnaturally thin and pale, with prematurely gray hair always pulled back in a severe style, and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the water-gathering process. Once visitors had completed their task and departed, she would immediately retreat into her cabin as if she had urgent business to attend to inside. As the drought persisted through September and October with no indication of relief, the number of people making regular trips to the Blackthorn well increased substantially. Some families began arriving twice weekly, others made the journey every few days, and word of the reliable water source began attracting travelers from as far as neighboring counties. Mavourneen maintained her policy of universal access, never questioning anyone about their origins, their circumstances, or their intentions for the water they collected. Jeremiah Crowder, a practical man, known throughout the community for his skeptical nature and careful attention to details that others might overlook, began experiencing a growing sense of unease about the entire arrangement. He had been making regular trips to the Blackthorn property since late September, initially grateful for the widow's generosity, but increasingly troubled by aspects of her behavior that seemed inconsistent with normal patterns of human interaction. In conversations with his wife that were later documented in her personal journal, he expressed specific concerns about the intensity with which Mavourneen observed the water collection process, the way she seemed to mentally count each bucket that was drawn from the well, and her invariable retreat into her cabin immediately after visitors departed, as if she had carefully planned activities that required privacy. The first indication that something might be seriously wrong emerged in early November, when several adults from different families reported experiencing unusual symptoms after consuming water from the Blackthorn well. The conditions were unlike anything that Dr. Mortimer had encountered during his extensive practice in the mountain regions. Severe abdominal discomfort, episodes of disorientation and dizziness, and a persistent metallic taste that continued for weeks after other symptoms had subsided. When questioned, those affected insisted that the water had appeared and tasted normal when they consumed it, but something about it had caused immediate feelings of nausea and weakness. Dr. Mortimer conducted thorough examinations of the affected individuals and was genuinely puzzled by the combination of symptoms they presented. In his detailed medical notes, preserved in the County Health Department archives, he documented that the conditions suggested some form of mineral poisoning, but chemical analysis of water samples collected from the Blackthorn well revealed nothing that deviated from typical mineral content found in water drawn from limestone aquifer systems. The doctor arranged for additional samples to be analyzed by medical colleagues in Charleston, but those results also showed only normal variations in mineral concentration that would be expected from such a water source. Despite the absence of conclusive evidence of contamination, reports continued to accumulate from families whose members had consumed water from the Blackthorn property. The symptoms remained remarkably consistent across different cases, but were not severe enough to cause permanent health effects or fatalities. Most individuals recovered completely within 2 to 3 weeks, though all reported that the distinctive metallic taste persisted much longer than any other aspect of their illness, sometimes continuing for months after their initial recovery. Sheriff Nathaniel Harwick, a methodical investigator who had served Pocahontas County with distinction for more than a decade, determined that the pattern of reports warranted an official inquiry. His formal visit to Mrs. Blackthorn occurred on November 30, 1923, and his detailed report, filed with county authorities on December 2, describes an encounter with a woman who appeared cooperative and appropriately concerned, but seemed emotionally detached from the implications of the health problems that had been reported. When Sheriff Harwick questioned her about the reports of illness among people who had consumed water from her well, Mother Nain expressed what appeared to be genuine concern, but maintained that she had been drawing water from the same source for more than 20 years without experiencing any health problems herself. She invited the sheriff to examine the well structure and surrounding area thoroughly, and even offered to provide him with a sample of the water, which he politely declined for official reasons. Sheriff Harwick's official report documented several observations that he found difficult to explain satisfactorily. The immediate area surrounding the well was maintained in an unusually pristine condition, with no debris, contamination, or signs of neglect visible anywhere near the water source. The rope and bucket system appeared to be recently installed, despite Mother Nain's claims that it had been in continuous use since her husband's death nearly 2 years earlier. Most significantly, there were extensive marks in the earth around the well that indicated frequent and systematic disturbance of the soil, as if the ground had been regularly excavated and then carefully restored. When the sheriff inquired about these soil disturbances, Mother Nain explained that she had been engaged in an extensive project to plant medicinal and culinary herbs around the well site, hoping to improve both the appearance and the practical utility of the area. She directed his attention to several small garden plots where parsley, sage, and other herbs were indeed growing, though the plants appeared to have been recently established and could not account for the full extent of the disturbed soil that was visible throughout the area. Sheriff Harwick's report also included detailed observations regarding Mrs. Blackthorn's general demeanor and living circumstances. He described her as exhibiting an unusual degree of emotional composure for a woman who had been living in complete isolation for nearly 2 years following her husband's sudden death. She demonstrated no apparent curiosity about events occurring in the broader community, despite having had minimal contact with neighbors or townspeople since becoming widowed. When questioned about her financial situation and how she was managing to maintain her property and support herself, she assured him that Cornelius had made adequate provisions for her needs, though she declined to provide specific details about the nature or extent of those arrangements. As winter weather began to affect the mountain regions and the drought conditions finally showed signs of improvement, with the season's first substantial rainfall, the frequency of visits to the Blackthorn well decreased considerably. Some families had discovered alternative water sources closer to their homes. Others had managed to repair or deepen their own wells, and a significant number had become sufficiently concerned about the reports of illness that they preferred to seek water elsewhere, even if it required considerably more effort and travel time. During this period of reduced activity around the Blackthorn property, Jeremiah Crowder made a decision to conduct more careful observation of the widow's daily routines and activities. His work as a hunter and trapper frequently took him through the forest areas surrounding the Blackthorn homestead, and he had begun to notice several details that troubled him significantly. Mavourneen appeared to follow an extremely rigid daily schedule, disappearing into what appeared to be a root cellar or storage building behind her cabin every morning shortly after sunrise, and remaining there for several hours at a time. The pattern of smoke from her chimney was inconsistent and unpredictable, suggesting that she was not following normal patterns of cooking and heating that would be expected from someone living alone during the winter months. Most disturbing to Jeremiah were the sounds he occasionally heard emanating from the direction of the well during his hunting expeditions in the area. Late in the evening hours, when Mavourneen should presumably have been inside her cabin for the night, he could distinctly hear the characteristic creaking sound of the pulley system being operated and the splash of containers hitting the water surface far below. On multiple occasions he observed a faint light moving around the well area well after dark, though when he investigated the same location during daylight hours, there were no obvious signs that any nighttime activities had taken place. These observations might have remained private concerns, but during the early morning hours of January 18, 1924, Jeremiah witnessed activities that compelled him to report his concerns to county authorities immediately. He had been tracking signs of deer movement that led him closer to the Blackthorn property than he normally ventured, and he was concealed in the tree line approximately 70 yards from the cabin when he observed Mavourneen emerge from her storage building carrying what appeared to be a substantial bundle wrapped in heavy cloth or canvas material. According to Jeremiah's sworn statement provided to Sheriff Harwick on January 20th, the widow appeared to be struggling significantly with the weight of whatever she was carrying as she made her way from the storage building to the well. She operated the pulley system herself, lowering and raising the bucket repeatedly over a period that Jeremiah estimated to be at least an hour. During this time, Mavourneen made several trips between the well and her storage building, each time transporting wrapped bundles that varied considerably in size and shape. When Sheriff Harwick questioned Jeremiah about the specific details of what he had observed, the hunter acknowledged that the distance and darkness had made it impossible to identify the precise contents of the bundles or to determine exactly what Mrs. Blackthorn was doing with them. However, he was absolutely certain that she had been systematically disposing of something in the well, and he was deeply troubled by the secretive nature of her activities and the fact that they were being conducted during the middle of the night, when she could reasonably expect to avoid detection. Based on Jeremiah's detailed testimony and the accumulating reports of illness among people who had consumed water from the Blackthorn well, Sheriff Harwick obtained a judicial warrant to conduct a comprehensive search of the property on January 24, 1924. The official documentation describes a thorough examination of the cabin, all outbuildings, the storage areas, and the surrounding grounds. Inside the main residence, investigators discovered evidence of normal domestic life, consistent with a woman living alone, in modest circumstances. Basic furniture, cooking implements, personal belongings, and household items that suggested someone maintaining a simple but adequate lifestyle. The storage building that Jeremiah had observed contained typical winter provisions, including preserved vegetables, cured meat, and various household supplies, though the quantities seemed unusually large for a single person living alone. More significantly, Investigators discovered several canvas sacks stored in a corner of the building that were heavily stained with what appeared to be soil and contained residue that Dr. Mortimer later identified as lime, a substance commonly used for agricultural purposes but also known for its properties in accelerating the decomposition of organic matter. The well itself presented a complex challenge for investigation. When Sheriff Harwick and his deputies lowered lanterns into the shaft, they could observe the water level approximately 25 feet below the surface, and the water appeared unusually clear and still, almost as if it had been recently disturbed and allowed to settle. The clarity was inconsistent with what would be expected from a natural well that was being used regularly for water collection, and there were unusual discolorations visible along the stone walls of the shaft that suggested the recent presence of foreign materials. Perhaps the most significant discovery during the initial search was the uncovering of detailed financial records that indicated Mrs. Blackthorne had been receiving substantial regular income from undisclosed sources since shortly after her husband's death. Bank records obtained from the county seat revealed monthly deposits that far exceeded what a woman in her circumstances would be able to earn through any legitimate means available in such an isolated location. When confronted with these financial records, Mavourneen became evasive and claimed that the money represented proceeds from the sale of personal property and household items that had belonged to her deceased husband, though she was unable to provide documentation or detailed explanations for any such transactions. The sheriff's investigation also revealed that the area immediately around the well had been subjected to extensive and repeated soil disturbance over a period of many months. Careful examination revealed that the ground had been systematically excavated and replaced multiple times, creating layers of soil with different compositions and mineral contents. Analysis of soil samples collected from various depths revealed unusual concentrations of lime and other chemicals that did not occur naturally in the area, as well as fragments of what appeared to be fabric, leather, and other organic materials that could not be easily explained. Dr. Mortimer conducted more comprehensive chemical analysis of water samples taken directly from the bottom of the well during the sheriff's investigation. These tests revealed significantly elevated levels of calcium carbonate, phosphates, and other minerals in concentrations that strongly suggested the recent dissolution of large quantities of organic matter within the water system. While the findings did not constitute definitive proof of deliberate contamination, they provided substantial support for the hypothesis that foreign materials had been systematically introduced into the well over an extended period of time. When presented with this accumulating evidence, Mavourneen's demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. According to Sheriff Harwick's detailed notes, she became increasingly agitated and defensive when questioned about the soil disturbances, the unusual chemical composition of the well water, and the source of her mysterious income. She continued to maintain her innocence regarding any deliberate contamination of the water supply, but her explanations became increasingly inconsistent and unconvincing as the questioning continued. The investigation reached a critical turning point on January 30th, 1924, when county authorities made the decision to drain the well completely in order to conduct a thorough examination of its contents. The process required more than a week to complete, as the natural flow from underground springs meant that the water level dropped very slowly and had to be continuously pumped to achieve complete drainage. As the water receded and the bottom of the well became visible, the true extent of what Mavourneen had been concealing began to emerge in horrifying detail. At the very bottom of the well, investigators discovered a thick layer of sediment that contained an extensive collection of human remains in various stages of decomposition, along with personal possessions including jewelry, pocket watches, coins, tools, and other items that clearly belonged to multiple individuals. The bones showed evidence of deliberate placement rather than accidental accumulation, and many were still partially wrapped in fragments of the cloth and canvas materials that had been used to bundle them before disposal. Dr. Mortimer's preliminary examination of the recovered remains indicated that they belonged to at least 15 different individuals, representing a range of ages from young adults to elderly persons, and including both men and women. Many of the skulls showed clear evidence of severe blunt force trauma, suggesting that the victims had been killed using heavy implements such as tools or weapons commonly available around rural homesteads. The condition and placement of the remains indicated that they had been deposited in the well over a period of many months, possibly extending back to the early summer of 1922. Mixed among the human remains were personal effects that began to be identified by families throughout the region as belonging to relatives and acquaintances who had disappeared over the previous 2 years. A distinctive gold pocket watch was recognized by the Patterson family as having belonged to their elderly uncle, who had vanished while traveling between towns during the summer of 1923. A silver brooch matched the description of jewelry owned by a traveling seamstress who had disappeared in the area during the autumn of 1922. As word spread about the discovery and families were invited to examine the recovered items, a disturbing pattern of disappearances began to emerge that had previously gone unrecognized because the victims had been traveling alone and were not from the immediate area. The investigation revealed that Mavourneen had apparently been operating a systematic scheme that targeted solitary travelers who came seeking water, particularly those who were unknown to the local community and whose disappearances were unlikely to attract immediate attention. The method appeared to involve deliberately contaminating the well water with substances that caused progressive weakness and disorientation, making victims increasingly vulnerable as they consumed larger quantities of the poisoned water over time. After rendering victims helpless through poisoning, Mavourneen would apparently kill them, using blunt instruments, and then dispose of their bodies in the well itself, while keeping their personal possessions and any money or valuables they might have been carrying. The systematic nature of the crimes and the careful disposal of evidence suggested a level of planning and calculation that contradicted any explanation based on mental illness or crimes of passion. During the final phase of the well excavation, investigators made additional disturbing discoveries that revealed the full extent of Mavourneen's criminal activities. Hidden beneath the main layer of human remains, they found evidence that she had been using the well as a disposal site for much longer than initially suspected. Deeper excavation revealed additional bone fragments and personal items that appeared to date back several years, possibly to the period shortly after her marriage to Cornelius in 1904. When confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence recovered from the well, Mavourneen's facade of innocence collapsed completely. According to Sheriff Harwick's final interrogation report, she admitted to killing numerous travelers who had come seeking water over the past 2 years, though she attempted to justify her actions by claiming that most of them had been weakened by the drought, and that she had merely assisted them in their suffering. Her detailed confession revealed a disturbing psychological framework that had developed during her years of isolation on the remote mountain property. She claimed that travelers who took water from her well were essentially stealing resources that rightfully belonged to her deceased husband's memory, and that she was justified in extracting compensation from those who could not afford to pay adequately for what they had taken. The murders had apparently begun as acts of rage against people she perceived as taking advantage of her generosity, but had evolved into a calculated system for acquiring the money and possessions necessary to maintain her isolated lifestyle. Further interrogation revealed that Mavourneen had developed an elaborate network for disposing of stolen goods through traveling merchants and traders who made irregular visits to remote mountain communities. These individuals typically purchased items without asking detailed questions about their origins, making it possible for her to convert jewelry, tools, and other valuable possessions into cash without attracting suspicion. Bank records confirmed that she had been systematically converting stolen property into money, which explained the regular deposits that had initially puzzled investigators. The confession also provided disturbing insights into the sophisticated methods Mavourneen had developed for poisoning her victims. She had apparently experimented extensively with different combinations of mineral salts and other substances that could be added to well water in quantity sufficient to cause gradual incapacitation without immediate death. This approach allowed victims to travel some distance from her property before succumbing to the effects of the poisoning, making it less likely that their deaths would be immediately connected to their visit to her well. The trial of Mavourneen Blackthorne began in April of 1924 and attracted significant attention from newspapers throughout West Virginia and neighboring states. The evidence against her was overwhelming, including her own detailed confession, the physical evidence recovered from the well, and testimony from numerous witnesses who had visited her property. The county prosecutor, Thaddeus Mulligan, presented a methodical case that documented the systematic nature of her crimes and the calculated planning that had made them possible. The defense attorney, appointed by the court due to Mavourneen's inability to afford private representation, could offer little beyond arguments for mercy based on her gender, her isolation, and the emotional trauma of losing her husband. However, the detailed evidence of premeditation and the systematic nature of the killings made it impossible to argue for reduced charges based on temporary insanity or crimes of passion. On April 28, 1924, Mavourneen Blackthorne was convicted on 15 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence generated considerable discussion throughout the region, as it was unusual for a woman to receive capital punishment, particularly in rural communities where traditional attitudes about gender often influenced judicial decisions. However, the systematic nature of her crimes and the large number of victims made the death penalty seem appropriate to most observers. The sentence was never carried out. On May 3, 1924, 6 days after her conviction, Mavourneen was found dead in her jail cell, having apparently used strips of fabric torn from her prison clothing to fashion a makeshift noose. The sheriff's report noted that she had left no final statement, confession, or explanation for her actions, and had refused to speak to clergy or family members during her final days. The aftermath of the Blackthorne case created lasting trauma throughout the mountain communities of Pocahontas County and surrounding areas. Families who had regularly collected water from the widow's well struggled with the knowledge that they had unknowingly participated in her murderous enterprise, and many reported persistent feelings of guilt and anxiety about their visits to the property. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims to include anyone who had encountered Mavourneen during her period of criminal activity. The Blackthorne property was immediately abandoned following the conclusion of the legal proceedings. The cabin was left to deteriorate naturally, and the well was permanently sealed with concrete by county workers to prevent any future access. Local residents avoided the area entirely, and the rough mountain road that had provided access to the property gradually became impassable as vegetation grew back and weather damage eliminated any traces of regular use. In the years immediately following the case, Dr. Mortimer conducted an extensive medical review of all the evidence related to Mavourneen's poisoning methods. His findings, published in a regional medical journal in 1926, detailed the sophisticated understanding of chemistry and toxicology that she had apparently developed through experimentation and observation. The doctor noted that her approach to poisoning had been far more complex and effective than would typically be expected from someone without formal medical or scientific training. The financial investigation into Mavourneen's activities revealed connections to a network of traveling merchants and traders who had been purchasing stolen goods throughout the mountain regions of West Virginia and neighboring states. Several of these individuals were subsequently investigated and charged with receiving stolen property, though proving their knowledge of the criminal nature of their transactions proved difficult in most cases. As news of the case spread beyond the immediate region, it attracted the attention of criminal investigators and academic researchers who were interested in understanding how an apparently ordinary mountain woman had developed into such an efficient and systematic killer. A criminologist from the University of Virginia, Dr. Pemberton Whitfield, conducted extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and reviewed all available evidence as part of a broader study of rural crime patterns published in 1927. Dr. Whitfield's research suggested that the combination of extreme isolation, economic pressure, and psychological trauma following her husband's death had created conditions that enabled Mavourneen's transformation from a conventional rural resident into a calculating predator. His analysis noted that the remote location of her property and the traditional mountain customs of hospitality and mutual aid had provided perfect camouflage for her criminal activities, allowing her to operate much longer than would have been possible in a more populated or suspicious environment. The case also prompted significant changes in how mountain communities approached the traditional practices of sharing resources and providing assistance to travelers and neighbors. While the basic customs of mountain hospitality remained strong, families became considerably more cautious about accepting help from strangers or individuals living in extreme isolation. Several counties throughout West Virginia implemented informal systems for monitoring elderly residents living alone, particularly widows who might be struggling with the practical and emotional challenges of maintaining remote homesteads independently. Years passed, and the Blackthorn case gradually receded from active public discussion, though it continued to influence community attitudes and practices in subtle but significant ways. The sealed well became a grim landmark that served as a reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind apparently charitable gestures, and the abandoned property became a subject of cautionary tales passed down through generations of mountain families. In 1956, during a period of renewed academic interest in Appalachian history and culture, a graduate student named Cornelius Vance from West Virginia University obtained permission to conduct archaeological research at the former Blackthorn property. His work, conducted over 3 summer seasons, focused on understanding the daily life patterns and environmental factors that had enabled Mavourneen's crimes to continue undetected for such an extended period. Vance's excavations revealed additional evidence of the systematic nature of Mavourneen's criminal activities, including a carefully concealed cache of personal items that had apparently been too distinctive or valuable to sell safely through her network of traders. Among these discoveries was a detailed journal that Mavourneen had maintained throughout her period of criminal activity, providing unprecedented insight into the psychological processes that had motivated her actions. The journal, which Vance discovered buried beneath the foundation of the storage building where she had kept her supplies, contained meticulous records of her victims, including their names when known, descriptions of their possessions, detailed notes about the effectiveness of different poisoning methods, and calculations of the financial value of items stolen from each victim. The entries revealed a methodical and business-like approach to murder that contradicted any explanation based on mental illness or emotional instability. The journal entries began in March of 1922, just weeks after Cornelius's death, though the first recorded murder did not occur until June of that year. The early entries described Mavourneen's growing resentment toward neighbors and strangers who she perceived as taking advantage of her isolation and vulnerability. She wrote extensively about feeling invisible and unappreciated within her community, and expressed increasing anger toward people who she believed were exploiting her traditional mountain hospitality without offering appropriate compensation or recognition. As the entries progressed through 1922 and 1923, They documented the development of her criminal enterprise in disturbing detail. She had initially considered simply refusing access to her well, but realized that this would violate mountain customs of hospitality and might attract unwanted attention from local authorities or community leaders. Instead, she began developing methods to discourage visitors while maintaining the appearance of cooperation and generosity. The poisoning strategy emerged gradually, beginning with small doses of mineral salts that caused mild discomfort and escalating to lethal concentrations as her confidence and expertise grew. The journal revealed that she had conducted extensive experiments with different substances and dosage levels, carefully observing the effects on her victims and adjusting her methods based on the results. She had also developed techniques for encouraging visitors to consume larger quantities of poisoned water than they might normally drink, often by commenting on the exceptional quality and beneficial properties of water from her well. One of the most disturbing aspects of the journal was Mavourneen's detailed analysis of her victims' behavior, possessions, and apparent vulnerability to her methods. She had become remarkably skilled at identifying travelers who were unlikely to be missed quickly, and had developed strategies for determining which individuals were carrying valuable items or substantial amounts of money. The entries also revealed her growing expertise in evaluating the market value of stolen goods and identifying the most profitable items for conversion into cash through her network of traders. The final entries in the journal, written during the weeks immediately before her arrest, demonstrated increasing paranoia and awareness that her activities might be discovered. She wrote about considering various strategies for avoiding detection, including the possibility of relocating to more remote areas of the mountains or destroying evidence of her crimes. However, she seemed unable to abandon the property that represented her only remaining connection to her deceased husband, and ultimately chose to continue operating until the inevitable confrontation with law enforcement authorities. Vance's research also uncovered evidence suggesting that Mavourneen had not been operating entirely alone during the later stages of her criminal activities. Financial records and interviews with surviving traders indicated that she had developed a particularly close relationship with a traveling merchant named Zachariah Morse, who had been purchasing unusually large quantities of personal items from residents throughout the mountain regions during 1923. Morse had disappeared shortly before Mavourneen's arrest, and investigators suspected that he had been fully aware of the illegal nature of his transactions with the widow and had fled when the investigation began. The graduate student's comprehensive research resulted in a detailed thesis that was completed in 1957. Though the full documentation was never published due to concerns about sensationalizing criminal activity and potentially providing a blueprint for similar crimes. The complete materials were archived in the university library with restricted access, and only portions dealing with historical context and social analysis were made available to other researchers and the general public. In 1962, investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation visited the former Blackthorn property as part of a comprehensive study of serial killing patterns in rural American communities. Their analysis, which remained classified for many years but was later released under Freedom of Information legislation, identified several significant patterns in Mavourneen's crimes that matched profiles they were developing for other cases involving systematic murder in isolated environments. The federal analysis noted that the Blackthorn case demonstrated how traditional rural values and customs could be exploited by individuals with criminal intentions. Mavourneen's offer of free water during a severe drought had been perfectly consistent with mountain traditions of hospitality and mutual aid, making it highly unlikely that potential victims would suspect any danger. This cultural camouflage had allowed her to operate much longer and claim many more victims than would have been possible in urban or suburban environments where such generosity might have seemed suspicious. The FBI investigators also examined the effectiveness of local law enforcement response to the case and generally praised Sheriff Harwick's systematic approach to the investigation. However, they noted that the delay between initial reports of illness and the launch of a formal investigation had provided Mavourneen with additional time to claim victims and dispose of evidence. Their report recommended improved coordination between rural medical practitioners and law enforcement agencies to facilitate faster responses to unusual patterns of illness or injury that might indicate criminal activity. By the late 1960s, the former Blackthorn property had been almost entirely reclaimed by natural forest growth. The concrete seal over the well remained structurally sound but was increasingly difficult to locate among the dense vegetation that had grown up around it. Occasional hunting parties or hikers would pass through the area, but few realized the historical significance of the small clearing that marked the location of the former homestead. The broader mountain community had largely moved beyond the immediate trauma of the 1920s, though some older residents retained vivid memories of the fear and suspicion that had characterized the period following the discovery of the well's contents. Several families had permanently relocated to other areas during the aftermath of the case, unwilling to continue living in such proximity to the site of such horrific crimes. Despite the passage of nearly half a century, the Blackthorn case continued to influence how mountain communities approached relationships with outsiders and isolated neighbors. Social workers and public health officials who served rural Appalachian communities during the 1950s and 1960s reported that many families remained deeply suspicious of offers of assistance from unfamiliar sources, and that establishing trust with communities that had been affected by the case, either directly or through cultural memory, often required considerable time and patience. One unexpected long-term consequence of the case was its impact on water rights and well maintenance practices throughout the mountainous regions of West Virginia. Many families who had previously shared water sources with neighbors began investing in private well systems, even when this required significant financial sacrifice. The possibility that a water source could be deliberately contaminated had introduced a new category of concern that extended well beyond traditional worries about natural contamination or seasonal availability. The final official documentation related to the case was completed in 1969, when the Pocahontas County Historical Society published a comprehensive memorial volume acknowledging the victims of Mavourneen Blackthorn's crimes. The publication included photographs of recovered personal items that had been identified by surviving family members, biographical information about victims whose identities had been conclusively established, and a detailed timeline of the investigation and legal proceedings. Today, the remote hollow where the Blackthorn homestead once stood remains largely forgotten except by local historians and the occasional researcher studying patterns of rural crime in early 20th century America. The forest has completely reclaimed the land, the witnesses and investigators have all passed away, and the mountain communities have moved forward with their lives. But the story serves as a sobering reminder that evil can flourish even in places where neighbors have traditionally looked after one another, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand exactly how to exploit the trust, desperation, and cultural values of their intended victims. In the drought of 1923, water was indeed freely available from the widow's well, but every bucket carried secrets that would eventually rise to the surface, revealing the terrible price that some unfortunate travelers had paid for a drink of cold, clear mountain water during one of the most challenging periods in Appalachian history.